Okay, so we did an introduction to James and Galatians last week. Now we're going to do an introduction to James itself. For those who were here last week, how did you feel about that? I was just so impressed with how they came together. Well, today we're going to look at what type of a book James is. So James is towards the end of the Bible. It's after the letters of Paul. It's the first of the what's known as the Catholic or general epistles. Catholic just means universal in this sense. It's not to the Catholic Church, it's just the Catholic epistles or the general universal epistles. And so, first thing I like to do when I'm starting to study a book of the Bible is to ask the question, what genre is this? It's an older term, it's more of a literary term. Genre means what type of literature? Is it a poetic book? Is it a narrative book? Is it a letter? Well, we know that it's a letter, but what type of letter is it? Is there a subgenre? So we know it's a letter that's been written, and one of the things that becomes apparent as you look at the genre is that it is very similar, and we talked about this a little bit last week, it's very similar to an Old Testament book. What Old Testament book might that be? Yeah? Proverbs, yes. It's very much like a wisdom book. So Proverbs is classed as one of the 5 wisdom books of the Old Testament. You've got Job, Psalms, Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, and Song of Songs, or Song of Solomon it's also called, or Canticles. So those are the 5 wisdom books, and there's a lot in James that is not just about Proverbs, but you can even see there's a specific reference to an Old Testament figure, and who is that? Job. Job is mentioned by name.
Yeah.
And so Job is the first of those wisdom books, and he speaks a lot about patience and endurance. And so James is a book that it mentions wisdom quite a lot. We're going to see wisdom as a theme throughout the weeks that we're going to be looking at this book. We're going to look at a few other things, but there's actually something else that we will see today about. So we're going to look at the first reference to wisdom here. So it's a wisdom book. It means that it is focused on 2 types of wisdom. Wisdom is like a coin, and on one side you've got wisdom, which is the theoretical, conceptual idea of wisdom, and that is what wisdom is in and of itself. Wisdom in and of itself is the state of being wise. It's the understanding. So you've got knowledge. The Bible, in the wisdom literature, there's a distinction made between knowledge, understanding, and wisdom. Wisdom, so to know something is to learn it, just learn it. But that doesn't even constitute wisdom. Are there a lot of smart people who are not wise?
Yes.
Yeah? And then understanding it is not the same as wisdom either, because understanding it is just to be able to go, now I know it and I can comprehend it within the context of other things. Are there people who are well understood and have good comprehension that are not wise? Yeah, because wisdom is that last step, which is to apply what you understand that you know. So you know, and then you understand, and then you apply it in a wisdom. So wisdom is conceptual. There's an abstract idea of wisdom, but then the other side of the coin is the practical, what wisdom looks like in practice. And so the book of Proverbs is full of proverbs and things that are telling us what wisdom looks like in your life, in your day-to-day life. James covers that same space in the New Testament. James is the New Testament book of Proverbs. And we see that there is a structure to James. One of the things I like to do is look at a structure. So we're going to look today at, there's a purpose statement. There's a purpose statement for why he's writing it, and that's in chapter 1, verse 1 to 4. And then there's 3 main themes that run through the book of James. And most of the rest of chapter 1 develops those 3, introduces those 3 themes. The first theme is wholehearted devotion. The theme of wholehearted devotion. James is speaking about how to be devoted fully to God. The second theme is exalted humiliation or humility. Okay? James talks about how we often think that humility or humiliation is a bad thing. But in James's mind, no, there's an exalted position to those who are poor, those who are weak, those who are suffering, because those people are closer to God because they know their dependency on Him. And then finally, there is receptive endurance. Okay, those are the three things: wholehearted devotion, exalted humiliation, and receptive endurance. And
Exalted humility.
Humiliation or humility? Humiliation. It doesn't matter. Humility comes from humiliation. Okay. Receptive endurance. And so it talks about this idea of making it to the end, finishing. I mean, these are themes you see in Paul's writings. So as we're looking at it, we're going to see that there's no daylight between Paul and James. They are both the same. We talked about that last week, but they're both speaking the same gospel. And so that's the kind of themes, that's the genre of what we're looking at. We're looking at a book that is there to present practical wisdom. Now, it doesn't go into a high Christology because it just assumes that his audience knows that Jesus died on the cross. He's writing to the Jewish Christians mostly in the very early times of the Christian movement. In fact, over the next 20 years from when he writes, Christianity sweeps the entire continent of Europe. It makes inroads into Africa. It's all the way through to Asia. It's just exploded in 20 years from when this first letter is written. By the time, there are stories that it made it to the British Isles, to India, to Ethiopia. We know that, and beyond within 20 years. That's how explosive Christianity is. It actually puts us to shame. But this is the beginnings of it. And so let's have a look. Let's go into it. We're not going to get very far. We're going to get the first 8 verses today because I really want to focus in on why he's writing it, what he's trying to get us to know about and see the context he's writing into so that we can see how that applies to us. Because we already know Jesus died for us. So we can look at what Jesus has done, and we did that through the whole book of Mark, but then the so what? So what do we do now? What do we do with that? Do we just keep on recapping what Jesus has done? No, there's an obligation, and James speaks of our obligation to our ethical obligation to each other and to the world. So he starts, James, a bondservant of God and of the Lord Jesus Christ. That word bondservant, I mentioned it last week, should be the word slave. Okay, it should be the word slave, and it's a dirty word these days because, slavery and all of the terrible things that were done in the past. When we think of slavery socially, we think of what? What do we think of? Just culturally.
People being captured, taken away from their home and village and brought to work until they died.
Yeah.
In plantations of rich people and all sorts of things.
Yes. When we think of slavery, we historically put it to a point in history, which is during the pre-Civil War America or pre the 1800s of England, where there was that terrible slavery that was happening. Isn't it great that humanity has wiped out slavery? Isn't it great that we have obliterated slavery 200 years ago, 150 years ago? Thankfully, we don't live in that time. Oh, wait, you're all laughing? Why are you laughing? There is more slavery on the earth right now than there ever has been. We often inoculate ourselves to the realities by historically placing it as a thing that happened back then. And it's an evil thing that's happening now in Southeast Asia, in South America, in Africa, in the West. It's even happening in our countries. It's happening in the black market, in this underground trade, and it's not so much slavery in terms of servitude as sexual, and so it's even worse today. So we can think of it as this historical thing, but it's actually a modern thing, and it's worse today. And that's why it's really important for us to take stock of that. But why is James using that? Well, there's two types of slavery in the Bible times. There's the slavery, the conquered slavery or the stolen slavery, where you go and you capture someone and now they're yours. That is a bad thing. The Bible always treats that bad. In fact, when we get to Galatians, Paul speaks about slavery as both a negative thing and a positive thing. So that's the negative one, is the slavery through conquest, slavery through dominance of power. But there's another type of slavery in the Bible. Does anyone know what it is? Come with me to Exodus. Come with me to Exodus. Keep your finger in James, because we're going back there. But come with me to Exodus chapter 21. Exodus chapter 21. So this is just after the 10 Commandments. Okay? And I'm just reading from chapter 21. So after the 10 Commandments, here's what happened. God spoke the 10 Commandments to all the people, and he scared the living daylights out of them. They said, we don't want to hear anymore. We can't hear anymore. We're terrified, Moses. Can you go up and get the rest of them? We think of the 10 Commandments being all there was. No, the 10 Commandments was just how much they could handle before they said, can you go up and get the rest?
We're going to die.
Yeah, we're going to die if he keeps speaking. Can you just go up and he can whisper them to you and you come and bring them to us? So Moses goes up, and for 3 chapters he goes up into the mountain. And here's the first part. It's the very first part. Now here are the judgments which you shall set before them. This is God speaking to Moses. If you buy a Hebrew servant. So now this is not a forced slavery. This is called indentured servitude. It's where you have sold yourself for the purposes of paying off a debt or raising capital or whatever it is. You've sold yourself into slavery. If you buy a Hebrew servant, he shall serve 6 years, and in the 7th he shall go free and pay nothing. If he comes in by himself, he shall go out by himself. If he comes in married, then his wife shall go out with him. If his master has given him a wife, and she has borne him sons and daughters, the wife and her children shall be the master's, and he shall go out by himself. But if the servant plainly says, now here's the thing, if the servant plainly says, I love my master, my wife and my children, I will not go out free, then his master shall bring him to the judges, he shall bring him to the doorpost, and his master shall pierce his ear with an awl, and he shall serve him forever. So when we see Paul say, I'm a slave, when we see James say, I'm a slave, they're saying it, I love my master. They're a slave out of choice. This is not the slavery out of no choice of your own. You're slaves to sin. That's the slavery that is out of no choice of your own. But when you become a slave of God, you're doing it because you love the master and you want to serve him. And so James is saying that. Now this is James, the brother of Jesus. We talked about that. Half brother, because obviously Joseph was his father, and possibly Mary, or maybe a marriage before then. There's 2 different traditions on this. Either James was from Joseph and a previous wife who died before Mary came along, or it was from Joseph and Mary, because we know that Mary eventually did have knowledge with Joseph. They did, knowledge.
They did have. They were married.
They were married. They got together and they had other children. There were other children of Mary, and so either way, he was either half. Mary's his mum, and Joseph's the father, or Joseph's the father and someone else. One way or another, he's either a step or a half brother. Imagine growing up. Who grew up with siblings? I did. I'm the oldest of 5. With siblings, brothers and sisters. Who ever got the line, why can't you be more like... Has anyone ever had that? Yeah? Imagine having Jesus as your sibling. Why can't you be... Yeah, he never does anything wrong. He never does, except for that one time that he wandered off in Jerusalem. Never does anything wrong. You'd resent that, wouldn't you? Yeah. You could easily see that could be a bone of contention, a point of resentment.
Like Christians can get resented too, exposing any guilt or shame.
Yes.
And fear.
Exactly. Alina, can you just check that it's recording? I tried, I don't know if I did. Just make sure. So with this is James, and he's now saying, I'm a servant of God and of the Lord Jesus Christ. He's actually saying, I'm a servant of my bro. of my brother who I grew up with, who never did anything wrong. He's got to that point. It's hard to deal with resentment, isn't it? It's hard to deal with comparisons. It's one of the worst things that we can do, is this idea of jealousies and comparisons. So he's gotten to that point, and notice that there's not a lot in the book of James where it talks about the position that Jesus has. It's just assumed that what they believe, and some say this is so early that they hadn't established Jesus' Christology, but he's treated as equal with God in that very first verse. A slave, James, a slave of God and of the Lord Jesus Christ. They're equal. Jesus is equal with God right there in the first verse of the first document that was probably preserved of the early church, which is James. There's a good case for James being even before Mark. And so he's writing, who's he writing to? The 12 tribes which are scattered abroad. Greetings. So he's writing, we talked about this last week, he's writing into communities of people who've scattered from Jerusalem since they started to persecute, and they've scattered everywhere, all over the place. And James has become the head. So James became the head of the church after Peter's imprisonment around 44 AD. So it's sometime after that, very early, because he's going to go on to say that there's synagogues, they're worshipping in synagogues. And he says, my brethren, now he starts, he just jumps straight in, There's no extended preamble like Paul has, big, long, grace and peace and etc., etc. He just jumps straight in. My brethren, count it all joy when you fall into various trials, knowing that the testing of your faith produces patience. But let patience have its perfect work, that you may be perfect and complete, lacking nothing. Okay, so let's just unpackage that. He does a few of these. This leads to this, leads to this. We're going to see that in a couple of weeks' time when we come back to chapter 1. This leads to this, leads to this. So trials is the first thing. When you fall into trials. Now this word fall doesn't mean you fall as in you overcome by them. It's the word that means when you're surrounded by them. When you happen upon a situation where you have trials. Now, does anyone have anything different instead of trials there in verse 2? Fall into various trials? Face trials. Anyone have anything different to trials? Some translations might have temptations. It's a word that has 3 levels of meaning in the Greek. So it means trials, temptations, and tests. It's a big, pregnant word, which can mean all of the above. So it's saying, count it joy when you are surrounded by trials, temptations, and tests. We're going to find out where these tests come from next time we get to James. But he's saying, count it joy when you're surrounded by them. Why? Are we ever not surrounded by them? Maybe when we're sleeping. If you're thinking, there's the potential for you to be tempted to think something you shouldn't be thinking. Count it joy. Count it joy when you're surrounded by this. These are people who fled Jerusalem, fled the area of Judea because of the persecution that's going on. They're now in maybe Babylon or Cyprus. They're all over the place, and he's writing into these communities, and he actually calls them brothers. These are people he probably knows because he'd seen them at feast time every year, 3 times a year. All the Jews would gather in Jerusalem. He'd know them from at least that. All the Christians would come with the Jews. He would know them from the ministry that he's done in Jerusalem. And he's saying, my brothers and sisters, because the word can mean, brothers and sisters. My brothers and sisters, when you're surrounded by trials, be happy, be joyful. Because the testing of your faith produces patience. So the trials are akin to the testing of our faith. Because every time there's a trial, we get a choice, what do we do with it? What do we do with the trial? What do we do with the trial? Hand it over to God. Trust him to deal with it. That's what he's saying. The testing of your faith produces patience, produces an element of being content. Just being content to just wait. Waiting. It's a waiting game. Patience is waiting. And patience, again, is another of those pregnant words. It's a word that means endurance. Okay? Patiently waiting for an end result. So your patience is an endurance. It's a perseverance.
It's also a fruit of the Spirit.
It's a fruit of the Spirit. It's not a passive patience, I'm just sitting back and waiting. It's a waiting expectantly for an end result. And so it's persevering, it's maintaining your faith through to the end. And so we have this, and then verse 4, but let patience have its perfect work. We talked a little bit about work today, but I want to focus in on this word perfect. Perfect is a word which, it's a dirty word in a lot of Christian circles. Because, the perfectionism. Has anyone heard, don't be a perfectionist. If we get too much in the Pharisaical mindset, in the mindset of doing, we can lead towards perfection. But here he's saying, let patience have its perfect work. Now this word perfect is misunderstood, which has led to a lot of people going down perfectionism and thinking, I've got to be perfect, I've got to achieve, I've got to get to a certain level. Perfection in the biblical sense, and this word perfect, there's actually an adjective and there's a noun. And between the two of them, it's how many times do you think it might be in the book of James? 7 times. 7 times. When something is found 7 times, it's a code to make sure you pay attention. So this, either the word perfect or the word completion is found 7 times in the book of James. So it's a word that he wants you to pay attention to, because the Hebrews would use 7 instances of something to draw attention, to draw your focus. And so this word, and we see it 2 times in this first little opening. He uses the word, and it's the word teleos. The word teleos means completion. It means lacking nothing necessary to perfection. So, for example, if you had a small shoot that's just come out of the ground, you planted something, is that plant perfect? It is perfect. In the biblical sense, it's perfect.
From the seed, then it's perfect.
Yeah.
And it will be completed.
Exactly. So it's perfect, lacking nothing necessary to completion. The biblical idea is that perfection is something that you have at every stage of your development. Okay? You're complete in Him. There's this idea of fracturedness. This idea of fracturedness that we have because of sin when we're without Christ. And Jesus came to bind up the what? The broken in heart. He came to bind them up and to make them whole, to take all those shattered pieces of our being and bind them together. Now, I don't think that the word perfect is doing the justice that we need here. There's an Old Testament word which I think comes really close to the idea here, shalom. Okay, the word shalom. Has anyone heard that word before?
Yes.
What does it mean? What does shalom mean? Peace? Peace is it's the very rudimentary meaning. It's a word that means completeness and wholeness. Okay, so when you wish someone shalom, you're actually wishing completeness to you, wholeness to you. And so this idea, but let patience have its perfect work, that you may be shalom and complete. You may be complete. You may be put together again. And so keep this in mind, because we're going to talk about how we get there in the next 4 verses. Lacking nothing. So it's the idea of lacking nothing necessary to wholeness and shalom. So he's really wishing them shalom, which is what Paul does when he starts a letter. Peace, grace and peace to you. He's actually saying, this is how you get peace. It starts with the trials, which you're already surrounded by. Then you put your faith in God and wait for Him to act, and that leads you to perfection, to completeness in Him. If any of you lacks wisdom, let him ask of God, who gives to all liberally and without reproach, without censure, without condemnation. If you ask God for wisdom, He's not going to say, "Oh, you're stupid. Of course you need wisdom. Here you go." He doesn't. He gives it to you freely, no reproach, and it will be given to him. But let him ask in faith, with no doubting. For he who doubts is like a wave of the sea, driven and tossed by the wind. For let not that man suppose that he will receive anything from the Lord. He is double-minded, unstable in all his ways. Now, here we see the penchant that James has. He's one of the most illustrative authors in the whole of the Bible, the New Testament. He uses so many, like it's like a ship, you know. The tongue is like a rudder of a ship. Or he has so many illustrations for getting his point across. And here we have this idea of someone who's tossed on the sea, on a wave of the sea, with no by the wind, you know, with no faith. If you have no faith, but he's talking about wisdom. Let anyone, if you lack wisdom, ask, and God will give it to you. Now here's the kicker, and this is really kind of tying us back into this genre. Who is famous for asking for wisdom in the Bible? Solomon. Solomon, God said, "Tell me what you want, Solomon. Tell me what you want." And Solomon said, "You know what? I would like wisdom." And God says, "Because you didn't ask for wealth, longevity, prestige, I'm going to give you those as well as wisdom. I'm going to give you the whole package because you asked for wisdom." So Solomon wrote the book of Proverbs. So we're kind of tying it back, but here's something that will just really, really make it cool. What does the name Solomon mean? It's derived from the word shalom. The word Solomon is derived from the word shalom. Solomon means peace. It means that completeness. So here we have the discussion of perfection, or of shalom, of completeness, of peace, and then ask for wisdom. This has got to be deliberate. This has got to be deliberate, that he's drawing your attention back to Solomon. He's saying, what I'm going to present to you are keys for living the Christian life. That's what the book of James is going to be about. Keys for living the Christian life in a world that's full of trials, in a world that hates us, in a world that is out to get us. Here's how you thrive. Here's how you thrive in this life. And the key principle here in between trials and completeness is what? It's faith. It's faith in Jesus, faith of Jesus. It's the faith that he has. So you've got the trials on one hand, you've got the perfection that we all strive for and long for, and in the middle, it's the faith that leads to a patience that leads to that completeness. So there are many who kind of downplay James on the faith side of things because he talks about works. But for James, works are the waiting. Works are the waiting that you do while you're having faith. You have the faith, you have this patient working. It's not your working. It's not your works, it's Jesus' works. And what that results in is you getting the reward, the completeness, the wisdom. Who lacks wisdom here? Yeah? Who could do with some wisdom? If you think that you don't need wisdom, then you're actually not going to get wisdom. Okay? The whole point is, the more you know you don't know. And so we should, if God gives you wisdom, do you need more wisdom? You need even more wisdom than you did before. Because he's given you enough wisdom to know how much wisdom you don't have. Alright? That's the way that it works. So if anyone lacks wisdom, is anyone here God? I don't think anyone's going to be. So if we're not yet God level, which we're never going to be, then we lack wisdom. We lack wisdom, so we need it from him. Jesus in the book of Proverbs you've got this concept of wisdom that's being spoken of through Proverbs chapter 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and then by 8 you get wisdom is personified, and then it's now a person. It's a person. It's Jesus. Jesus is wisdom in Proverbs 8. He says, "I was begotten. I was brought forth. I was there with Yahweh when he created the world. I was his delight." This is not talking about a concept. This is now talking about a person. So unless any one of us is Jesus, we lack wisdom. So we need to get it from him all the time. And that is the key. That is the key to dealing with these trials, because the wisdom conceptually tells us how to interpret the trials that are going on around us. And the wisdom that is practical tells us how to live within those trials. What to do, how to shape our lives, how to be shaped by the word that is going forth. I haven't given a lot of attention to James, to my own detriment in the past. But as I've been going through and studying this, I'm excited about James. I'm excited about going through and learning, because he's now set the stage, and wisdom will weave through the rest of the book. And we're going to see that these are proverbs that he doesn't have to tell us who Jesus is and all that. That's assumed knowledge. That's the point that we're at. We're already there. He's now going to help us to thrive. And I'm really excited. Is there any thoughts that you guys have from these 8 verses? Anything jumping out at you guys?
Yeah, ask for wisdom.
Ask for wisdom, yes. Ask for wisdom and believe. Don't doubt. Don't doubt. Yeah, do not doubt. If you ask for wisdom, go about acting as if you've got the wisdom from God. Not your own, but from God. Because if you doubt, then you're going to still be... Yeah, you'll be tossed around. You'll be tossed around. You've got... The only ship that doesn't get tossed around in a storm is what? A ship that is anchored. Or a sunken ship, yes. A ship that is anchored. So the anchor is what will stop you from being tossed around. And so therefore, faith is the anchor. Faith is the thing that stops us. He starts it off. Count it joy when you're in trials. We're all in a storm. The difference is whether we're tossed around by the storm or not. Faith is the thing that stops us from being tossed around.
Yeah, so good.
Anything else jump out?
When you're in that situation he's talking about, it's when it's so tempting to lose faith. And he's saying we need to have faith.
Yeah, that's it. Everyone is going through trials, not just Christians. Everyone. What stops us from being from losing all that hope is the faith. Yeah.
It brings me back to the fisherman, that when the big storm came and Jesus was asleep. It brings you right back there where they didn't have the faith. And he was like, be a little faith, to do it again, that sort of thing. And that's exactly what it is, doesn't it? That's why you have to go forward. When you ask for something, like you said, you have to go forward, believing
Yes.
that you're got it.
Act as if. Faith could be translated as act as if. In fact, let me give you faith is acting as if it's already happened. Let me give another illustration. If I learn everything there is to know about parachutes, do I have faith in parachutes? And by that I mean I know the safety record, I know how they work aerodynamically, how they stop you from just plummeting, they capture the air. Do I have faith just by reading everything there is and knowing all the data? If I believe, let's say I'm sold on the idea of parachutes. Yep, they work. I believe in those parachutes. If anyone jumps out of a plane and they've packed the parachute correctly, and it's a new parachute, it's not an old one, they've done a check, it's packed correctly, they jump out with is that faith? No. No. If I believe that if you jumped out of a plane with a properly packed parachute at the right time and pulled it at the right altitude, if I believe that you could be saved from falling to your death, it's not faith. It's only faith when I jump out with a parachute strapped to my back. A little bit later we're going to see that even the devils believe in God, but they don't have faith in him. Faith is when you trust in the parachute to take you to the ground. You don't have faith if you just have knowledge and belief. You have to have knowledge and belief and trust. You have to do it yourself. And so that's the concept we have here. If you ask for wisdom, take that leap with the parachute that God has given you of wisdom. He's going to help you get through it. The trials are not greater than the equipping that God will give you. So, does that help you understand faith? Faith is sometimes one of those Christianisms. I just have faith. No, this is how you have faith. Jump out with the parachute. Jesus is the parachute.
It's a bit like Greg was talking about last week about building the school in Vanuatu, and he actually ordered the materials before he had the money to pay for them because he believed they would
Exactly.
go and do it.
He knew exactly what was going to carry him to safety. Yeah, that's it. Well, let's have a prayer, and we will pray also for the food. Unless there's any other questions, any other thoughts? No? Well, Karen, would you like to? Thank you.
Heavenly Father, we just thank you for another beautiful day, even though it's raining outside. Lord, it is a beautiful day because you have gifted us with life. Life that we can exercise our faith in you. Lord, we've been challenged this morning to ask for wisdom. And so I just do exactly that. Jesus, we need more of you in each of our lives. We need the personification of wisdom in our lives. So we just pray, Jesus, that you will pour out yourself and that the Holy Spirit will dwell in each of us as we go from this place this week. And that, Jesus, you will give us insight and wisdom into each situation that we come across in the coming week. Lord, I pray for each of our community members and the issues that they are facing. And I pray that you will gift them with the wisdom that they also need. Father, we just need you. This world is hurting and under immense stress and trial. And we know that as sin comes to its conclusion, that this is only going to grow in immensity. So, Jesus, when that happens, we need more and more of you. So we just pray for your presence in our lives. I thank you for the food also. I thank you that you gift us. You promise us that you will meet our needs. And Lord, you have done that also today. So bless the food as we partake and our conversation